It was just a few months ago. On a weekend at the end of winter, it was cold and rainy. I was comfortably nestled at home, thinking that this was the last bit of the cold winter and that the temperature would soon start to rise. Not long after dinner, there was a sudden knock on the door. I got up and walked to the door. Looking through the peephole, I saw a strange man standing outside. He was wearing a brown jacket and a beanie, and he was holding a snow shovel. However, there was no snow on the ground, and I was filled with confusion, wondering what he was doing here. I opened the door just a crack and asked him what he wanted. After listening to him speak for just a few seconds, I felt that something was wrong. He stammered and rambled, saying that he was just a kind-hearted person looking for some work to do in my yard. I felt a shiver down my spine and thought that this whole thing was very strange. So I refused him and was about to close the door. But the man quickly put his hand on the door to stop it. He stared at me for a while before letting go. I quickly closed and locked the door. When I came to my senses and looked out the window again, he had already walked onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the misty rain. I watched for a while longer to make sure he had really left. And then I went back to watching the movie. At that time, I thought that although this man was suspicious, he probably wouldn't come back and might just go to another house to try his luck. An hour later, the rain became heavier. I was still in the living room watching another movie, and waves of drowsiness were hitting me. I could barely keep my eyes open. Suddenly, a dull thud came from above, waking me up because of the heavy rain outside. It was hard to tell exactly how loud the sound was, but I was sure it came from upstairs. I got up and went upstairs to check, wondering if something had fallen or if there was a leak in the ceiling that had caused the house to make a noise. But after looking around, I found nothing. Maybe it was the sound of the gutter loosening due to the heavy rain, or some other reason. I didn't think too much about it, and went back downstairs to continue watching the movie. When I was ready to go to bed after finishing the movie, it was almost 12 o'clock at night. I turned off the TV and all the lights downstairs, and then went upstairs. As I was approaching the top of the stairs, I clearly felt the temperature drop. Maybe I was too tired to care much about it. But when I went to close the doors that I had opened before, from the corner of one of the rooms, I saw that the window was open just a crack. I stared at the window for a full 10 seconds, thinking how this was even possible, and my heart was filled with confusion. I walked closer and took a look. There was a small overhang under this window, and on the window sill, I could vaguely see what looked like a shoe print. I turned pale instantly and turned around to listen quietly to the sounds around me. The low, creaking sound of the house, combined with the sound of the raindrops hitting the roof, made me feel even more uneasy. I knew that someone must have broken into the house. I started to walk back as quietly as possible, returning to the hallway. All the other doors were still open, and I felt as if someone was staring at me through one of the doors. With great difficulty, I made it downstairs. I picked up my phone and hid in the garage and called 911. 5 minutes later, the first police officer arrived. During this time, all I could hear was the sound of the rain. After I led the police officer into the house, I waited on the porch while he searched the house. About 2 minutes later, I heard him shout from upstairs, and then he came downstairs escorting a man in handcuffs. I recognized him at a glance. He was the man who had appeared at my door earlier that night. When he passed by me, he had an angry look on his face and was pushed into the police car. Later, I realized that this man had climbed onto my roof, and that dull thud was probably made by him. Then he climbed into the second-floor window, and I had never thought of locking that window. The most terrifying thing was that the police said he had been hiding in the master bedroom, and I had almost walked into that room to sleep without realizing he was inside. After he climbed in through the window, he even took off his shoes to avoid leaving shoe prints on the carpet. Fortunately, I found that small shoe print on the windowsill. It was really a miracle. Judging from the fact that he went straight to my bedroom, his intentions were obviously malicious. Thank goodness the judge agreed with this point as well. Although several months have passed since then, I still often have trouble sleeping at night, always feeling that there is someone hiding in my house in the middle of the night. A few years ago, I planned to move in 6 months, so I found a temporary job at a local gas station, hoping to earn some money in advance. The job paid quite well and it was a night shift. All I had to do was stay at the cash register and do some regular maintenance work occasionally. In the 4th month of my work, there was a customer who came frequently. He would walk into the gas station almost every night at around 1 or 2 o'clock. What he bought each time was rather random. Sometimes it was daily necessities, sometimes food, and sometimes tools. I always thought it was strange because these things could be bought more cheaply and conveniently at an ordinary grocery store. And he didn't talk much either. All I knew was that his name was Dave. He drove an old red Chevrolet sedan, and he looked to be around 40 to 45 years old. One night, at around 1 o'clock in the morning as usual, Dave drove into the gas station. There were no other customers that day, and I was sitting in the corner passing the time. When Dave walked in, he seemed a bit different. He was sweating profusely and was hurrying around the aisles looking for something. Finally, when he found what he was looking for, he rushed to the counter and threw the item at me for checkout. It was a bicycle lock. I didn't want to pry, but seeing him sweating and in a hurry, I felt that something was off. So I tried to ask him in a friendly tone, "Dave, nice to see you again. Did you get a new bicycle?" He didn't even look at me. Instead, he fumbled around with his wallet and quickly took out the money. I didn't ask any further. After checking him out, I watched as he rushed back to his car and drove away. At that time, I thought that maybe he really had bought a new bicycle, ridden it for a few hours, and was in a hurry to go back and lock it up for fear of it being stolen. Although the reason was a bit far-fetched, that was the only thing I could think of. In the following days, I didn't see Dave, which was quite unusual because he usually came every night. It wasn't until I was working on a Wednesday that I saw his car again. It was drizzling outside, and business was very slow in the first few hours. I was leaning back in my chair and looking out the window at the rain when his red car pulled into the parking lot. As soon as he parked, he got out and rushed inside. I greeted him when he entered, but he ignored me. He walked around the aisles, muttering something under his breath. I couldn't hear clearly, but he seemed very irritable, and I immediately felt uneasy, as if my intuition was telling me that something was about to happen. Suddenly, I heard a dull thud and looked in the direction of the sound. Only Dave's car was parked there. The sound was very loud, as if someone was kicking the door from inside the car. I looked at Dave again. He stopped hurrying around and stood in the aisle, staring straight at me, as if I had discovered something I shouldn't have. Then there was another dull thud. I stared at Dave, filled with panic. He quickly averted his gaze and rushed out of the door. I was stunned, but I quickly took out my phone and took a photo of his license plate. Then I called the police right away. That night seemed extremely long, as I kept waiting for news from the police. It wasn't until around 6 o'clock in the morning when I got home that I received a call from the police. They found the man through the license plate number I provided, and they also discovered that he had kidnapped a woman. It turned out that he had just moved into a small cabin on the edge of town for less than a week, and he didn't have a registered address before, so the police had no idea about his previous whereabouts. Fortunately, they rescued the woman in time, and she wasn't harmed. Later, it was also found that Dave wasn't his real name, but at least he was locked up and couldn't harm anyone anymore. During my spring break when I was 14 years old, it happened to be my parents' wedding anniversary. They went on a date to the north and stayed overnight in a hotel. Finally, I got the chance to invite my friend Justin over to play at my house. Justin brought a lot of snacks and soda. We laid them out on the table in the basement, turned on the game console, turned up the volume of the stereo, and had a great time playing for 3 hours. Later, Justin went upstairs to the kitchen to get some water. When he came back, he looked worried. He said he saw someone outside the kitchen. Our house had a large sliding glass door, and he seemed to have seen someone standing in the backyard. I thought he was joking, but seeing how serious he was, I went upstairs with him to the kitchen to check. At first, we didn't see anyone in the backyard, but soon we noticed some stains on the outside of the glass door, which looked as if someone had leaned against the glass and peeked inside. It was so scary that I quickly pulled down the blinds. Then we did a quick check around the other windows. Since we didn't find anything else unusual, we thought everything was okay and went back to the basement to continue playing. A few hours passed, and it was already late at night, probably around 2 or 3 o'clock. Justin was tired from playing, so we finished our last game and turned off the game console. There were 2 small sofas in the basement, so we each lay on one, spread out the blankets, turn off the lights, and prepare to go to sleep. I don't know why, but I just couldn't fall asleep. I would doze off for a few minutes and then wake up again, and this happened many times. Maybe it was because I had drunk too many caffeinated drinks. I felt like more than an hour had passed, and suddenly something was different. I opened my eyes. It was pitch black in the basement, but there was a thin streak of light at the other end of the room. I sat up a bit and found that the light was coming from the door above the staircase. I looked at the sofa where Justin was sleeping, and he was still sound asleep. I thought to myself, could have gotten up to get some water? But how come I didn't notice it at all? I felt very uneasy and decided to go and see what was going on. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The door was ajar, but the gap was too small to see anything. I walked up the stairs and opened the door a little wider. I found that the hallway light and the kitchen light were both on. At that moment, I suddenly remembered the person that Justin said he saw standing outside the house. So I walked to the kitchen to see the situation outside the back door. The backyard was empty and there was no one there. Just as I was about to look away, something moved in the reflection of the glass door. I spun around and looked down the hallway. Whatever I had just seen quickly ran across the other end of the hallway. I didn't know what to do. I stood there stunned for a moment, and then I desperately ran back to the basement and woke Justin up. I briefly told him what had happened, and he was just as terrified as I was. We hid in a closet in the basement and called the police. While we were waiting for police to arrive, we could hear someone walking around upstairs, as if running around the house and looking for something. After a while, the sound disappeared. When the police came, that person was already gone. They found that the small bolt on the back door had been broken, and that was how the person got in. Since then, every few months, we would find the same kind of stains on the back door, clearly indicating that someone had been looking inside from the outside. It wasn't until we installed a surveillance camera that this situation stopped, or at least we didn't find any more abnormalities. But what that person really wanted to do, we still have no idea to this day. When I was a child, my mother's boyfriend, Ian, had a really bad temper. He often quarreled with my mother, and even kicked down both the front and back doors of our house. Since they were never repaired, we couldn't lock the house at all. They spent every day in the bar. The incident happened when I was about 12 years old, and my younger brother was 10. I was quite small at that time, and my brother was in poor health, thin and frail. That night, just like usual, my mother and Ian were in the bar. My brother and I were playing a game console with the door closed in his room. It was probably around midnight to 1 o'clock in the morning, and we were having a great time when I suddenly heard a strange noise. My brother didn't hear it, and I didn't want to scare him. So I said I was going to the kitchen to get something to drink and asked him to stay in the room. I promised to bring him something to eat. To get to the kitchen, I had to walk down the hallway, which was directly facing the front and back doors, and the kitchen was behind the living room. I kept hearing those strange noises. So before leaving my brother's room, I asked him to hide in the closet and pretend to be playing a game, so that when I came back with the things, the game would be ready.
I wanted to get my brother to hide this way without scaring him because he was easily frightened and had severe asthma. At that time, he didn't have an asthma inhaler or a breathing treatment machine. I knew that if he had an asthma attack due to fear, the situation would be really bad. I left the room and decided to find out what was going on. Although I was only 12 years old, I had to be brave to protect my brother. I walked along the hallway as quietly as possible, feeling extremely scared, and always having a premonition that something bad was about to happen. Before reaching the end of the hallway, I heard a man's voice, which was like a growl. The voice was deep and terrifying, and I felt a churning in my stomach, almost vomiting. I was so scared that I didn't dare to move. I didn't know anyone in this town. My father was in another state, and my mother was dead drunk in the bar. I could only muster up my courage, thinking about what was around the corner, and also trying to figure out how to deal with the situation. Just then, I heard the door of my brother's room open. He saw me and realized something was wrong from the expression on my face. and he also froze. I think he must have heard that growl too. I quickly motioned for him to go back to the room with my hands, and he did as I said. Finally, I gathered my courage and peeked around the corner. The sight I saw still makes my hair stand on end to this day. A man who was probably about 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed over 300 pounds was sitting on the sofa, wearing an evil smile on his face. His eyes and that smile were deeply engraved in my mind. Somehow, by luck or something, the man didn't see me. I slowly and cautiously walked back to my brother's room, closed the door, and started thinking of a way out. My brother was already terrified by that growling sound, and I was very grateful that it wasn't him who saw the man. I tried my best to put on a brave big sister's face, and calmly told him that there was a strange big man on the sofa, and that he had to be very quiet, be brave, and control his breathing. My brother adored me, and when he heard what I said, he tried his best to calm himself down. I first tried to open the window, but it was stuck and wouldn't open no matter how hard I tried. I knew the man outside was dangerous, and I had to find a weapon to protect my brother. I remembered that my elder brother had a sword, but I couldn't remember where it was. Just then, I heard the man say, "I know you're here." My stomach knotted up, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I broke out in a cold sweat. Right after that, I heard my brother start gasping for breath, and he had an asthma attack. I hugged him, reminded him to be brave, and told him to sit still and focus on his breathing. I frantically tried to open the window, but it just wouldn't budge. While I was rummaging around for something, I found my elder brother's cell phone, which he always forgot to take with him. I felt so lucky and let out a sigh of relief. I immediately called the police and told them what was happening in a low voice as much as possible. The police told me to stay on the phone so that they could hear what was going on. After about 5 minutes, the man started banging on our bedroom door. I could no longer keep calm and started screaming, a blood-curdling scream. Our bedroom only had one working lock. Although the door was locked, he kept banging on it, and the sound got louder and louder. He was shouting for us to open the door while banging. Suddenly, his banging stopped, and then there came a burst of laughter. He said, "Little girl, I can break down this door in 2 seconds, you know." Then he started knocking on the door gently, asking me to open it, and his tone became very eerie. Then, I heard a scraping sound on the door. At that time, I thought he was scraping the door with his long fingernails. Later, I found out that he was using a big knife. It wasn't long before I heard the police shouting at him to get on the ground and put his hands up. I heard him resisting and there were more shouts. Finally, everything went quiet. After a while, someone knocked on the door, but I was so scared that I thought that terrifying man was still outside. I kept screaming, "No, please," and was shaking all over from crying. I couldn't be brave in front of my brother anymore. My brother and I sat on the ground, hugging each other, thinking we were going to die. Finally, a female police officer knocked on the door, and then I opened it. There were probably 5 police officers standing in the hallway. They had heard my screams. I held my brother tightly and ran to the female police officer, breaking down and crying hysterically. It turned out that the man was completely drunk and high on drugs. The police asked me to stand in front of the man, and asked if I knew him. I didn't, but I will never forget standing in front of that huge man, looking into his bloodshot eyes full of hatred, and I will never forget that growling sound he made and the look of pure horror on my brother's face. Later, my parents were investigated by the police because they left us alone at home and didn't repair the broken doors. My mother has changed now. She doesn't drink anymore and is married to a police officer. I asked my mother about this later, and she told me that the man had a big knife, as well as ropes, tape, and a tarp. I still don't understand why he didn't just break the door down. The door was very thin, and he could have easily kicked it open with just one kick. This incident has always scared me, and I often have nightmares about it. Now, when my husband forgets to lock the door at night sometimes, I get really angry because I have to check every room, every closet, and other places where someone could hide. I have 2 children, and I will never let them go through what I experienced when I was a child. I'm 19 years old now. I moved to another state 6 months ago and live with 2 roommates. The structure of the house we live in is a bit special. The living room of the neighboring house is exactly my bedroom. That is to say, I have a space that used to be a kitchen, and the entire living room is my private area, with a wall separating me from the neighbor's house. There are 3 doors in my room. One leads to the hallway, one is connected to the kitchen and is right next to another door of the neighbor's house. And there is also a living room door, which is beside the neighbor's front door. I'm telling you all these details so that you can have a clearer understanding of how my neighbor, Bethany, has been peeking and stalking me through this shared wall. Bethany really dislikes the people living in my room. A few years before I moved in, she had unpleasant experiences with the previous 2 tenants. Bethany is quite old and has a cat. Although our community actually doesn't allow pets, as an old resident, she has been grandfathered in. Her brother also comes over frequently. He's a bully and is very unfriendly to all of us living here. There is another neighbor named Catherine on the other side of Bethany's house, but she's rarely at home. I guess she hasn't experienced the things I've been through. In the past 2 months, Bethany has become more and more like a stalker. She doesn't directly follow me or my roommates, but she's always observing and listening in. She will wait until she sees one of my roommates go out and get in the car before she starts causing trouble for me. She has 2 doors to go outside. The front door is a longer route and passes through her living room, where she often blatantly monitors us. The other door is connected to her bedroom. She will stand on the porch or poke her head out of the window and give us the middle finger as we pass by. Although this is very annoying. At first it was just some petty annoyances, just to show that she didn't like us. Later, she started knocking on the door. The wall on my side isn't particularly thin, and you have to be really loud to be heard through it. Before I moved in, I heard that Bethany wasn't very friendly to the people living in my room, so I've always been paying attention to the sounds. There is a big TV in the corner of my room, and there is also a desk with a computer, but I rarely use them. On Bethany's side, there is also a TV right behind the one in my room. When I'm alone at home or come back late, Bethany will walk to the door next to my room and gently knock on it, saying in a very eerie, singing voice, "I know you're home." If I have Amazon packages or other deliveries, she will bang the packages against my door and shout in her eerie voice over and over again, "Come out, you have a package." This situation lasted for several weeks because in December, I received a succession of gifts from my family. My birthday is also in December, and at the same time, there were also some packages of school supplies, household items, etc. Her behavior was creepy, and it was obvious that she had been waiting for me to come home. I know that when the front door of her house and the side kitchen door through which I enter and exit open, there will be a faint sound due to the change in air pressure, but usually, one has to pay special attention to notice it. From December to the beginning of January, Bethany would pick up the packages at my door and then throw them at the door. She didn't damage the packages, but it was enough to get my attention. Sometimes she was very angry because I didn't respond, and sometimes she continued her strange behavior. Our main roommate thought that her behavior wasn't serious enough to get her evicted, but still informed the landlord. The landlord apparently also told Bethany to stop, otherwise the police would be called next time, because she was disturbing our living environment on this side. Since then, she has restrained herself a bit and no longer touches my things. At most, she will scream at us as we pass by or give me an angry middle finger, which is already a blessing in disguise for me. However, in the past 2 weeks, her behavior has escalated. It can occur at any time of the day, especially around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. She will sing loudly towards the wall of my room, and she specifically targets the part of the wall right in front of my bed. The content she sings is baffling, such as, "I can hear you on the phone," and so on. At this point, her behavior is no longer just simple provocation, but makes people feel that there is something wrong with her mind. If it gets quiet on my side, she will bang on the wall hard and scream obscenities. She even knows when I'm taking a shower. A few times, her screams were so loud that I could hear her in the bathroom. She shouted, "You bastard, turn the water off." A few times, she also ran to the 2 porches of her house and screamed at me through the door. The things she said indicate that she has been monitoring what I'm doing. For example, once when I was having a video call with my mom, she shouted, "Turn your phone off." When I was playing games on the TV with the volume set to only 2, she could scream, "I can hear those damn video games." Even worse, when I was having a video call with my boyfriend and getting ready to fall asleep, she shouted, "He snores too loudly." This is really terrifying. Recently, this kind of noise and harassment has become even more serious. Our main roommate is a kind and gentle person, so at first, she was reluctant to take tough measures, but I'm very worried that these petty annoyances will eventually turn into a threat to me, or even worse, she might try to break into my room. I think she may have some mental problems, but she has never been diagnosed. I've met Bethany, but I really don't want to meet her alone. I'm afraid I can't help but punch her because I can't stand being monitored and intimidated in my private space. I will keep everyone updated on her behavior. She often shouts at and throws things at her cat and her visiting brother. Her behavior is quite violent and really strange. Once again, Bethany, I don't want to face you alone, or there will definitely be trouble. As the days went by, Bethany's actions became even more outrageous. Once, when I came home from work late at night and just stepped into my room, I heard a sharp whistle coming from the other side of the wall. The sound seemed to be deliberately provocative and was extremely harsh in the quiet night. I suppressed my anger and ignored it, but the whistle lasted for nearly 10 minutes before gradually stopping. Another time, on a weekend morning, I wanted to sleep in, but I was woken up by a rhythmic knocking sound. I opened my eyes groggily and realized that it was Bethany causing trouble again. She seemed to be holding something hard and knocking on the shared wall again and again. She was muttering something, and although I couldn't hear the specific content clearly, her sarcastic tone made me feel annoyed. I covered my head with the quilt, trying to block out the annoying sound, but it was of no use. In order to have a moment of peace, my roommates and I have tried many ways. We added extra locks to the doors and installed thick curtains on the windows that block light and sound. But Bethany seems determined to oppose us. She can always come up with new ways to harass us. She started placing some strange things on the steps in front of our house, sometimes withered flowers, and sometimes notes with inexplicable words written on them. One day, when I went out to take out the trash and just opened the door, I saw a tattered doll at the door. Its eyes had been gouged out, and there was a weird smile painted on its face with red paint. Next to it was a note that said, "You can't escape." When I saw this scene, I felt a chill down my spine, and got goosebumps all over my body. I quickly threw these things away, feeling angry and scared. I really couldn't figure out where I had offended this neighbor to make her target us like this. We reported the situation to the landlord again, and the landlord talked to Bethany several times, but she only promised not to cause trouble on the surface, and still went her own way behind our backs. In desperation, my roommates and I planned to install a hidden camera at the door of our house, hoping to capture her harassing behavior as evidence to report to the police. On the day of installing the camera, I specifically paid attention to Bethany's movements. Sure enough, when she saw us tinkering at the door, she poked her head out of the window to look. Her eyes were full of vigilance and hostility. I glared at her, but she wasn't afraid at all. She even made a face at me, and then closed the window. At that moment, I was even more determined to let her be punished. I couldn't let her harass our lives so wantonly anymore. After the camera was installed, my roommates and I were full of expectations that we could get conclusive evidence of Bethany's harassment. However, several days passed, and in the surveillance footage, there were only the usual people coming and going, and no abnormal behavior of Bethany was captured. At first, we thought she had finally held back, but soon we found that this was just the calm before the storm. One late night on a Wednesday, I was burning the midnight oil in my room, rushing to finish an important report. It was very quiet around, and only the sound of the keyboard tapping accompanied me. Suddenly, a strong vibration came from the wall, followed by a series of dull crashing sounds, as if someone was hitting the wall with all their might. I was so startled by this sudden commotion that the pen in my hand fell to the ground. I quickly opened the surveillance software, and the image on the screen made me furious. I saw Bethany wearing a black bathrobe and holding a baseball bat, madly smashed and crashed against the wall that we shared, and she was still shouting non-stop. Although I couldn't hear the specific content clearly, her ferocious expression and crazy actions were enough to show her malice. I didn't hesitate to call the police and describe the current situation to them in detail, informing them that there was surveillance video as evidence. While waiting for the police to arrive, Bethany's attack became even more intense. The wall seemed to be shaking, and I was worried whether the old structure of the house could withstand her rampage. About 10 minutes later, the police siren sounded outside the house. I rushed out to greet them and showed the police the surveillance video. The police quickly came to Bethany's door and knocked on it. When Bethany opened the door, there was still a trace of madness on her face, and she was still holding that baseball bat in her hand. The police gave her a serious warning and informed her that her behavior had already constituted suspicion of harassment and damage to other people's property. If she committed the offense again, she would face severe legal sanctions. Under the authority of the police, Bethany nodded repeatedly on the surface, pretending to admit her mistake. After the police left, I thought the matter would finally come to an end, but a few days later, when I was preparing to go to work in the morning, I found that the tires of my car had been deflated, and there were several long scratches on the body of the car made by a sharp object. The first thing that came to my mind was Bethany. After checking the surveillance, I indeed saw her skulking around my car, holding a sharp tool in her hand. I contacted the police again. This time, the police said they would conduct a more in-depth investigation of her and would strengthen the patrol of our community. At the same time, I also consulted a lawyer and considered safeguarding my rights and interests through legal channels, making Bethany pay the due price for what she had done. During the police's in-depth investigation, my roommates and I were on tenterhooks all day long. When going out, we would subconsciously pay attention to our surroundings, for fear that Bethany would come up with some new tricks. Every time we came home and saw the closed door of our house, a sense of unease would well up in our hearts, not knowing what situation we would face when we opened the door. One evening, I came home from work as usual. Just as I reached the door, I smelled a pungent odor. Looking closely, I found that a large puddle of paint had been splashed in front of my house. The color was so bright that it was blinding, and stood out particularly on the white steps. The paint hadn't dried yet and was flowing down the steps, forming strange marks. Needless to say, this must be another masterpiece of Bethany. I suppressed my inner anger and quickly checked the surveillance. In the footage, Bethany was wearing a hat and a large raincoat. Taking advantage of the night, she sneaked up to my door, carrying a bucket of paint in her hand. Without hesitation, she splashed the paint on the steps. After she finished, she stood there proudly for a while, as if admiring her achievement, and then swaggered away. I immediately sent this surveillance video to the police officer in charge of the case and called the police again. The police soon arrived at the scene, took photos of the paint marks as evidence, and also asked the surrounding neighbors if they had seen anything unusual. However, most of the neighbors said they hadn't noticed because Bethany chose to commit the act when everyone was preparing for dinner. At this time, everyone was inside the house, and few people would pay attention to the situation outside. The police told me that according to the evidence currently in their possession, Bethany's behavior was already suspected of intentionally damaging other people's property, and they would speed up the investigation process and strive to bring her to justice as soon as possible. At the same time, to ensure my safety, the police strengthened the patrol intensity of the community, especially at night. During the days of waiting for the investigation results, my roommates and I discussed and decided to install a more advanced smart door lock at the door, and also added some emergency alarm devices inside the house just in case. We also applied to the company to work from home to reduce the number of times we went out and avoid direct confrontation with Bethany. As the investigation deepened, the police found that Bethany had not only harassed our family, but also had disputes with other neighbors. Her behavior had already aroused the strong dissatisfaction of the surrounding residents. The police decided to work together with community workers to conduct a comprehensive psychological assessment of Bethany, to see if she had any mental problems. If there were really problems, corresponding treatment measures would be taken, and at the same time, her illegal behavior could be better dealt with. After a series of investigations and evaluations, the police finally obtained sufficient evidence. They formally filed a lawsuit against Bethany on multiple charges, including intentionally damaging other people's property and harassing others. In court, Bethany couldn't deny the conclusive evidence, and was finally sentenced to the corresponding punishment by the judge. This long nightmare finally came to an end, and my roommates and I could finally heave a sigh of relief and return to a peaceful life. After this incident, we cherished the hard-won peace even more, and also deeply understand the justice and power of the law. After the judgment came into effect, Bethany was taken away according to law, and the community suddenly became quiet. The suffocating and oppressive atmosphere also dissipated. My roommates and I could finally sleep peacefully at night without being disturbed by unwarranted noises.